Thank you. And so this is going to be a little bit different from the stuff that I talked about. Well, we still have a lot of signal processing and EEG and all that, but I'm going to talk about emotion, and I know that Sridhar talked about William James. I'm going to talk about William James in a little bit different context. So, William James was, I think, if you talk about any founding father of any particular discipline, so particularly when people, all of us who studies emotion, so maybe William James is sort of the founding father of this field, because he talked about something which is going beyond at those times, the way which psychologists and philosophers used to understand emotion. So, as you see, he says that common sense says, we lose our fortune, we are sorry and we weep, we meet a bear, are frightened and run, we are insulted by a rival, are angry and strike. So, basically what it means that in a sense of common sense, right, the common sense understanding for your brain processing means that you see a bear, right, you get frightened and you run, right. So this is a common sense understanding, a very simple emotion, which is the fear processing, which is very important for our survival. But James talked about it's rather the opposite. So your natural bodily responses to seeing something like a predator is to tremble, and that's why you get a fear, right? So it's the other way around compared to what the common sense directs you, and which is remarkable, because the common sense was common sense with a lot of observations. To go beyond something like that and saying at those ages was truly remarkable. So what he is saying essentially is a bit different, that bodily changes follow directly from the exciting fact that our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion. So sometimes his point is, we cannot distinguish between the two because of the fast nature of brain processing. So you don't really feel your trembling, then you say that you get like you are fearful, because it happens very kind of simultaneously, right? Or you are in a sort of, in Delhi, if you it's a very common thing to have road rage. So, and you might have heard like newspaper stories, right? So people get angry. So it's like, it's not really they see other person, but it's something innate in them that is actually creating this rage. So that's what the Lang theory of emotion, the James and Lang theory of emotion, which also came out from another researchers who followed James and took this to a different level. So he looked at this, different. So he was a neurologist, and he, for example, tied sort of these occurrences of major depressive disorders to something like, higher uric acid in blood. So which kind of correlational with something that major depressive disorder. So essentially what it means that you have an emotional stimulus, right? So all these James Lang theory kind of can be distilled to something like this. You have a physiological response, so your bodily sort of organs are reacting to the environment. So as you see any stimuli like a predator or something which you think will anger you, maybe some missiles or something blowing up a child, things like that, you kind of get angry about, right? So these are things that the reason for that is your physiological response, which is getting excited, right? Physiological response is altered because of seeing these stimuli, and that is going to give rise to this affective experience. So essentially that your physiological responses is very essential to feeling. So if you don't tremble, then you don't get like fearful. If you are not like, your like skin is sort of burning, you are not having the rage, you are not angry enough, right? So this is the other way to think about it. So Cannon-Bard, on the other way, wanted to test this idea. So there are two people that I forgot the Philip Bard, and I think I forgot the name of Cannon. I think James Cannon. They looked at the physiological changes and subjective feeling of an emotion in response to a stimulus as separate and independent, and said that these two are two distinct processes, meaning that one need not occur for the other to happen. So this is something came as a critique to the James Lange theory of emotion, and what they kind of do to prove that, Cannon removed the sympathetic nervous system of the cats, which controls the vasomotor sensors, meaning these includes your structures like the thalamus. Right? So thalamus people have talked about, for example, superior colliculus, the structure that Sridhar was talking about, that is part of the thalamus. So if you remove that part, so thalamus is supposed to be a gateway into the brain. So the brain signals from your eyes or ears go first to the thalamus. It kind of like a sort of analog filter, which then filters the information and send it to the brain. So that does some kind of a processing. So what he found out that even if you remove the thalamus, or they found out that cats still displayed emotional responses such as hissing or raising of fur. So you cut out the thalamus of a cat, they can still feel that, you see the physiological response. Now whether the cat, you can't do this experiment to a human, of course, right? So, but it's a subjective response. But what it says is that you don't really need to process the stimuli to get this physiological response. So essentially, some of these behavioral things, attributes we attach to emotion can occur in independence of any kind of stimuli. So essentially what James Lange was talking about, there is a connect, this is some sort of a serial order process, but what they are saying, these two things are kind of parallel. It's happening somewhat, there is an interaction, but there is a lot of things that are happening in parallel. So these two are kind of, two important theories about emotion that we have not been able to sort of, completely resolve to this date, like which one is which or whether it is a mix of both. So essentially there are two systems, two parts of the nervous system which is responsible for the processing a lot of these arousal and emotion related stimuli. So you have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. Is there anybody from biology background, pure biology background here in this? None of this, okay. None. Oh, you are? Okay. So you have heard about sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic system is responsible for flight or fight response. So something, if you see some road rage, whether you want to flee the spot or you avoid or you want to get into a fight, dependent on the whatever damage to your whatever vehicle it is. So that's what it decides, right? So that's the sympathetic system. You have the parasympathetic system, which kind of is active when you are kind of sleeping and this kind of stuff, right? And you also have another nervous system which actually a lot of people these days are talking about. I think you might have heard about this concept called gut brain. So gut brain axis, how stomach or the gut is sort of attached to a lot of our emotional feelings, depressive disorders. So that's actually the enteric nervous system. So these three are the three nervous systems which connects our body to different organs, and the different organs of our body are responsible for giving rise to this emotion. This is what I am trying to sort of, if there is one take-home message from this talk, what I really want to say today is that, a lot of the emotions we feel is actually sensed by our bodily organs, and this is how the brain is interacting with the organs is very important thing to study from, and of course it's from a complex system point of view, it's very interesting. So to summarize, so this is common sense. So you have a, which is a very common thing in India these days, that you have a dog which is kind of coming after you, and you have a conscious feeling which is this fear. This is how you think you are aroused. But James Lange is saying that you are autonomically aroused maybe because of your history with dogs and whatever your systems or physiological systems create this response because of years and years of training. And this gives this degree of arousal. So if you are more stressed, for example, your hormones are getting vigorously secreted, so you are going to feel more scared and things like that, right? So this is what James Lange is saying. Cannon is saying that there are two sort of independent parallel circuitry, because there are some things that go directly quickly to the cortex. There is a high road and there is a low road to this kind of for this emotion stimuli to go to the different parts of the brain, and the subcortical brain activity and the cortical brain activity are kind of parallelly driving this conscious feeling and arousal, and that's causing you the fear. There is another sort of theory that talks about emotion in slightly different way, and this is somewhat similar to sort of in the context of Sridhar's talk, that you have an autonomic arousal and your body's attention system, intrinsic attention system, is kind of always trying to appraise or weigh out. There is some kind of a latent decision variable it is computing. So there is some kind of criteria it has to go over, take a certain threshold to create that whether you should be fearful of the stimuli or it's something benign. So whether the dog is something like wagging its tail will make you feel to not be afraid, versus if you take those environmental stimuli, you might want to appraise out if the dog is very seemingly very stressed out with the kind of features it displays, you should get fearful and run away. So these things happen via some kind of an appraisal. So essentially your arousal system needs to be appraised based on your previous learning, previous knowledge and prior knowledge, and that gives rise to the conscious feeling of emotion, and this is something goes as the Schachter theory of emotion. So today what I was going to
yeah. Can you go back?
Yeah.
The third example is the Cannon bird.
Yes.
The first one is William James.
The first one is the common sense. So you have emotion as a conscious feeling, and there is something like some stimuli are going to be emotionally laden. So for example, this is something the way we normally think. For example, seeing some kind of your office picture, like in your nobody puts their office picture as the desktop background. Have you seen anybody doing that? But because that would be very enormously depressed. So we have pictures from Iceland or Greenland or something from rainforest. So usually, so that gives us this arousal, this feeling of of emotion. So this is the common sense, right? So this is the common sense idea, that if you put the conscious feeling is somewhat laden in the stimuli, which gives rise to this arousal, and this is how you feel emotion. But James Lang will argue that if you have an office sort of picture, that's not going to arouse you, as simple, or it can be some celebrity sort of figure you can put or something that's going to arouse you, and that's why we use those kind of images as desktop background, right? So that's basically the way James Lang is going to argue, right? Clear?
Sometimes we can be afraid of things that we don't understand. Like we are feeling fear, but we don't know why we're feeling.
Yes, yes.
So that would fit only with the third.
True. Yeah, there are all sort of things you can relate to, but the point is that the common sense sort of view is that everything is in the stimuli, which it is not. It's really the bodily system that how it reacts to certain situation is giving you the yeah.
How is James Lang different from Schachter?
Yeah, it is not very different. It is actually an extension of the James Lang, because here it is there is no separate. So this was later. Schachter is a very new theory, to be honest, and the James Lang is much older theory. So this is a kind of a sort of extension of the James Lang theory, the Schachter theory. Okay, so the second, so this takes us to the first actually idea that we are going to propose, that how do we really measure emotion. So if this is such a matter of, and this is where person-centric, that thing in the title, that what do I really mean by the first person-centric emotion. So in some sort of common sense, like I almost convinced you that your the desktop background cannot be your office space. Picture from Iceland is something, it takes you to a happy space. So that's there is something latent component or some kind of latent emotion is hidden in those images, right? So in some sense that the image of Iceland, like some scenery from Iceland, is going to make you happy. So it's something, the stimulus itself has a property of being happy or sad. Now this is kind of a fair approach, and a lot of people, if you see the way dancers, for example, if you look at these dancers from Kerala, they have these different facial expressions to sort of have different kind of emotions are being conveyed to these different emotions. And there are some basic set, and this is quite intriguing, and if you go across the world, and these kind of dances are very, this is not from Kerala though, this is I think from somewhere from the western world, and it looks very similar to the ones that from that that Kathakali dance, right? So essentially what it means is that there is some basic set of emotion, and this is a lot of, and I am not citing many people, I'm bad with names, I am not as good with Dipanjan with all these citations. I don't remember the name, but this is a culmination of work of several people. So that there are basic set of this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 emotions: sadness, happiness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. So these are universal. So these people have come to sort of think about, these are the 6 different kind of emotion which exist in across every culture, and every, at least from the view of humans, and of course we want to extend this might also be there in the animals as well. Right? Now accordingly, what people have tried to do is use this kind of faces. There is this enormous face databases, it is found in different countries. I mean Japan has one kind of facial database, you have in Europe there is a facial database. So you can build your own facial database of emotion laden stimuli such as this. So people, previous studies measured emotion, whether now what do you think this guy is, is he across all these, what is his? Angry, right? So this is something everybody would acknowledge, this is angry. What is this one? Surprise.
Happiness.
So this is very simple, right? So this is what I am saying. So it's amazing, just by changing the facial features. Now try an AI model to do this. It will fail enormously, massively. And this is something, one of the research questions in Google, for example, how do you detect emotion? This is a very serious question. How do you detect emotion from stimuli? All of you, almost there was no debate what each one of these faces mean. But try with AI model. There will be all these heat rate, false alarm rates.
But with the very facet of detecting emotion on the faces also come from our memory and the way brain essentially learns to understand this is surprise versus this is fear.
Right. Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely true. It is consolidated over years and years of training and prior.
Correct. So AI models, I would argue, current AI models in emotional AI literature or affective computing actually has reached that level of essentially detecting humor versus fearful faces. So there are models which people have actually developed which can do it, right?
But
because
nowadays the surprising
if the stimulus is well labeled, right? If the stimulus is well labeled,
yes,
and if there is supervision, right? Those models can reach as good
So there
accuracy
are a
as
lot of
humans,
asterisks, right? So that's what I am trying to say. There is a lot of, yes, you can train AI eventually, probably, and I am certain with lot of firepower in computation and minds you can do that. But the point is, and with a lot of supervision, but the point is, I didn't need any supervision here, right? So I just asked the question, everybody gave identical answers, and B, take it for granted that, at least believe me, I am not wrong. You ask this to any culture, if I go to US and do the same thing, exactly the same way people will respond. So there is something remarkable about our system. You can say that, and even if you do with AI, you will have a lot of false alarms, you will have a lot of issues with the performance, but in humans it bang on. Now one would also argue that some of the disorders that Dipanjan was showing the other day, this is exactly where autistic children have difficulty with. So they can't distinguish between the emotional content of these faces particularly, and hence this kind of learning through these faces is very important for their therapies. So this has a lot of value in this kind of research, essentially in why do certain people, right, which we can, so all of you are atypical, right, or typical, sorry, and there is an atypical development which can emerge where people have exactly trouble with something so easy. detecting the emotion, basic sets of emotion. So, this is something we should think about, right. Now, when we go to neural basis of emotion, so there is these two gentlemen Panskep and Ekman from Sweden, they talked about this different kind of these areas of the brain. So, they divided different areas of the brain are giving rise to these different kind of emotional feelings, like fear is coming from this, I think these areas like this putamen, disgust is coming from, for example, these very deeper areas. These are these orbitofrontal areas are involved in this anger kind of and same with the surprise kind of stimuli. So, all these different kind of views are there, the different kind of these basic set of emotions. Since once people found out there are certain 6 basic set of emotion, the next stage is how do you map them to different location of the brain. This is a segregationist view of emotion. There is this has been challenged quite a bit lately, and people are talking about there it does not exist like an anger area or a sadness area or a different kind of areas, but rather these are there is some kind of core affect areas which are kind of reorganizing their activity, and this is people like Lisa Feldman Barrett, Russell, Louis Pessoa, they have been talking about, and these also involve the language areas. So, and these areas can be divided into 2 basic sort of like categories. One is these executive function areas and one is this conceptualization kind of areas. So, the conceptual areas are the ones that are involved in developing concept. For example, auditory areas, Broca's area, language areas, they will be conceptualization areas. The orbitofrontal areas, they will be sort of executive function areas. The frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, they will be sort of executive function areas. Now, and if you look into this, so there are different kind of mixtures of these areas or different kind of these areas that are there. This emotional sort of network of the brain is considered to be this limbic system, which involves our amygdala. Amygdala is an area which is involved in lot of this fear sort of stimuli processing, and this has been shown by several people, like for example, Joe Ledoux for example is the pioneer in this field. Even in India, Shona Chatterjee had worked a lot in this area, amygdala. There is this saliency processing and ventral attention network also has been implicated. This is an area that me and Dipanjan had worked quite a bit with some of our students. We did not present the data and how these areas were involved in different kind of processing, how to process actually involved in attention. So, essentially in this kind of a view of if you take the integrative view of emotion, what we are trying to say that there is a dynamic component to it. All these areas are getting reorganized as we go flow in time. So, the emotions are not static. There is not something called this perpetual state of sadness or happiness. Those are pathological state that can happen in certain case of diseases like major depressive disorders, if you have acute depression and things like that, right. If you think that you belong to that category, if you feel that you are like overly depressed, it can happen for anybody. So, you should immediately seek a physician's help, like those disclaimers they give in these medical ads, right. So, it is not something that you treat leave untreated. So, the point is that you have this from the and you can think about all sorts of different things, like you have perception, there is action, and there is this whole world of stimulus from which we select stimulus, and there can be different ways to view this, that there is this can be viewed as a process model, that how you compute values of a stimuli and hedge out these values compared to the low cost ones, high cost one, all those sort of things you can have. You can also have a predictive processing view, prediction mismatch view of emotion as well, like emotion gives you to like to allow you to make sure your predictions are good. So, if you are if your ability to prediction increases, you need to have a lot of emotional affective quotient to add it to your stimulus processing. Another way to think about attention also is via the lens of emotion. You can only attend to things when you actually feel something about it, like your feeling should be strong about it, then only you will be able to attend. For example, when your parents probably told you pay attention to this subject or pay attention to this, you should be first feeling happy about it. So, the James Lang has to be there, your inner Lang has to be aroused, right. So, to about the subject to pay attention to it. So, emotion is in the sense it can be very basic, it can be very sensory in nature essentially. So, what we are trying to do, what we trying to sort of in what we are proposing here is that in order to understand emotion in a very dynamic sense, you cannot rely on phases which are inherently very static, it does not change, it gives you a very snapshot answer, like all of you agreed to that is about it, but it does not capture your emotional state space beyond that. So, all of you, since you are all agree, maybe if I do a sort of now I take a psychological battery across all of the people present here, there will be variations from different levels of at the subclinical levels, even there will be fluctuations of depression scores, anxiety scores, some people are more anxious about things that are going to happen. So, how do we address this variation? By using something as a phase stimuli for doing the identifying emotional space, which is very static. So, what we are trying to say that it is not possible. So, what we have to go on to something like a understand emotion as it sort of is in the nature, meaning it is heavily dynamic, it changes over time and it changes quite rapidly. Now, but the question is, will the response to the stimuli, now the advantage of using the phases was that I can use define a brain area for sadness and fear, though I mean nobody would in the sense of mind would believe that there is such a network, because there does not exist such a network. Even though I can do that, because I show a happy face, everybody seems happy, then I go and scan people when they are seeing this happy face, then I see some brain networks kind of active, then I can say this is some sort of happiness network. It is very easy, it is intuitive. But the point is that it is not really true that it, because it requires a lot of involvement of these other areas, which Louis Pessoa and Feldman Barrett is talking about, that this is reorganization of these areas that they are talking about, right. So, what we are trying to say, in order to understand the dynamic nature of your emotion, you cannot work with static phases, and one of the way that you can do that is to use music. And in what better way than you have in India, we can have this very interesting sort of our culturally we have a musical system which actually depends on emotion. So, a lot of these Hindustani and Carnatic classical ragas actually has dedicated sort of sequences devoted to emotion. For example, there are certain ragas that are that gives you a feeling of happiness, there are certain ragas that makes you feeling romantic, there are certain ragas that makes you feel very sad, melancholy. So, all these different emotion is ingrained in these ragas. So, can we use this kind of dynamic nature of emotion that this raga elicits into some sort of an emotional to develop a stimuli to assess your emotion, which can be better correlated to the psychological sort of test scores. So, this is what I really talk about, first person account of emotion. Now, everybody will respond differently. So, this is something, for example, a stimuli that my students developed, Shashwati and a master student. Shashwati is a PhD student and Austin is a master student, and Ritu also recently graduated, she is a PhD student. So, they kind of develop this stimuli paradigm, where once you are hearing or seeing a movie. So, once you are hearing some piece of music, or we make all these visual stimuli also to understand how the visual networks are also involved in emotion. So, there is this joystick which you see she is holding, you can move this joystick in certain axis. Now, the way that we instruct the subjects, if they are happy, they have to go to extreme this right hand side, if they are very aroused. Now, what is happy versus aroused? So, think about that, you can be very excited about a sad song, correct. So, sometimes sad songs also excites you. So, then you will be on this side here, right. If you are happy and you be hearing some sort of hip hop or rap or something like that, you can be going here, versus you are very excited about some kind of a ghazal, you can be here, right. So, these are the ways that you can define this space. So, if you are happy and sort of aroused, you can go in this direction, if you are happy and aroused, sort of sad and aroused, you can go here, and this will be something which is something you find very boring or not very exciting, you go along this axis. So, usually what you see, these are actual recordings of people, how they are moving the joystick at different, it is slow motion. So, that you are seeing their movement with a joystick of different subjects, and this is typically how they look, and the kind of like you know look get into this entire space, the entire Cartesian space, to like report their emotion. So, what we think that if we can understand these patterns of how you are moving the joystick and parse out this whole behavioral space or making out these patterns. So, this is very important for understanding our emotion, and this will be the first person account of emotion. I mean, of course, I mean, as Dipanjan suggested that one approach can be to use something like a AI model to use it. We are not there yet, but that is something that we would want to go. So, the stimuli that I am going to be using is actually validated before by one of my colleagues, Dr. Nandini Chatterjee Singh, who was in sort of in NBRC for a long time and looked at these ragas and their excitation of. She did a Facebook study where she made people listen for different parts of the world, from Norway, from India, and turned out people who do not have musical backgrounds typically. So, for example, associates these ragas, these 8 ragas she used. So, for example, it starts with Hamsadhwani, which gives you a calm, happy sort of thing. The Basant Mukhari is giving you a very sad, longing, sort of tensed kind of feeling, and this is very similar across cultures. Okay. So, there is a bit of there is something universality to it, like how you understand emotion through this Hindustani classical music. So, now what we did, we combined this music in a very randomized fashion. So, when the subject is inside the scanner and seeing, so there is a projection screen here and there is a mirror apparatus, though they can see this kind of circular space, and as previously I told you that they are trained to report their emotion with a joystick without moving much on the screen. On this joystick is calibrated to their the joystick movement will be recorded in the screen in front of them in real time. So, they have a feedback where they are, and they are going through this entire space. So, essentially they are accounting when they are listening, and this is something that I think in the next slide I will I can show you what it kind of what the subject. So, these are the projections on the x axis and y axis. Now, till now I have not talked about these two axes. So, unless so it goes through different phases. The joystick movement. So, and this is something which you see in the 2 dimension. This is across time and this is collapsed across time view. So, what you see is that eventually what you see that you have the entire space. So, we have a pattern of where your emotions are through this entire landscape. Now, an important part to note here is that the way we think about emotion in this kind of view is that the emotion is not going through 6 basic states, but the 6 basic states of emotion are manifestation of essentially a 2-dimensional state. So, this 2-dimensional axis of valence and arousal, valence meaning what is the kind of whether the emotion is a positive or a negative emotion, that will positive emotion will have like positive numbers as valence, negative emotion like sadness will have negative extreme of valence. So, this will give you sort of this x axis, and the arousal is how much excited you are to how calm you are. So, this combination of these two, the valence and arousal numbers, defines, for example, if you have a valence very high, and also arousal very high, you will be very happy. If you have a valence very sort of in the negative side, and you had arousal also very high, you are going to be sad, too much sad. But then you will also have surprise, and these things also exist in somewhere around this space. So, not very happy, but something very, and similarly combined with negative. If it is a something surprise, it is a very happy surprise, then you will be somewhat here. If it is a sad surprise, you will be here. So, all these combinations of arousal and valence gives you the different sense of. So, you basically parse the entire space of different kinds of emotion. There was a question.
Yeah. So, has a single subject been exposed to the same song and asked to do the same exercise multiple times to see if the trajectory sort of matches across the same song?
That is a good question. No, we have not done that, because it is kind of people will have different states of memory. So, whether it will always be it is usually a different difficult experiment to do, because the ideal way to do this in the same subject, if you want to repeat this, you at least change the sequences of the the ragas, because the ragas are dynamically changing. So, the raga points were dynamically changing, we call them that I think it is not here, but it is in a different slide. So, here. So, this is that the points where you see these jumps, these are the where the ragas are changing. Yeah. So, all these blocks, this looks like this square wave, ragas are changing. So, there are these 8 ragas. So, all these ragas, the labels are given. So, it in order we start with Hamshadhvani and all the way to Raga Jog. In between you have the Tilak Kamot, which makes you typically very happy, and Basant Mukhari is so sort of goes from very sad. Now, these are the things that we are interested really. So, when you go from Basant Mukhari to Tilak Kamot, whether it is going to, so this is something you are going to sad to happy. So, similarly you can go from Hamshadhvani is a little bit calm, but then you can have this Yaman which is on the negative bit lower on the valence side. So, you can also look at happy to sad. So, it is structured in the way that we want to see these transitions between happy to sad emotion and sad to happy kind of emotion in the different sort of ways. Yes.
Sir, does the stimulus, the nature of stimulus, like sense in general, auditory stimulus or visual stimulus plays a role in determining the emotion?
Yes, I think it does, but I do not have proof as of now. We have not done the comparative study, but we have developed the stimuli, we have the data, we have not done the analysis. But we want to look at exactly those kind of questions, whether the visual stimulus, is there a common set of emotion areas which are involved in both visual and auditory question, but we are not there yet. We have the data, but we have not looked at that question.
But you can think about it also in this way, that instead of a musical stimuli, if you take let us say a Hitchcock movie and which goes through a series of events, right, and those transition points where the movie clips actually changes from high arousal to low arousal, you will also see the same kind of jumps. So, in that sense, whatever is observed in the musical context or stimuli is also observed.
Should be, you should have these kind of,
right. So, in the movie is even more naturalistic, right, because you have both audio and visual components.
So, we have done with movies that are typically only visual, for restricting ourselves to visual, not with the audio visual, but the audio visual is also will be equally interesting. So, now how do you really assess this behavioral space, which is very complicated? So, what we proposed is that this is something that we had worked out so quite a bit. So, this is typically how the distance from the center looks like. So, you can compute the instantaneous displacement from the center. So, this gives you peaks like this. You can compute velocity, you can compute acceleration. Turns out that we had some better results, best results in correlation with we also have subclinical scores. We made the subjects go through depression, psychological batteries. So, we turns out this acceleration is a good marker, and I will come back to that. And in fact, there is more higher order sort of transitions, like you can actually take the derivative of acceleration, which is we call jerks. So, these are even better markers of emotion. So, this where this acceleration is changing. So, think about it, when you are taking the joystick and moving it, if you are accelerating, means your emotion is suddenly changing, and then you are not accelerating, either you are doing a slow drill or you are just just hanging in there, your acceleration is going to be 0. So, you are going through, you can mark the stable states of emotion versus the periods where there is a change in emotion through whether the acceleration changes, just tracking acceleration of a subject. So, this is typically what we do. It is very messy though. So, these are what we call is the event boundaries, where the ragas are changing in the top, and this is the response of each subject which you can see, and this is time. So, what you see is that all these different sort of rasters are places where acceleration sort of happened, and there is between these spaces are stable emotion, then acceleration stable this way there, right. Now, typically you can also sort of if you are around the event boundary, you can also define some sort of latency to an emotional stimuli, emotional latency or reactivity, and my student likes to, I am not still very convinced about this measure, but this is what we call in is emotional reactivity, like reactivity to an emotion. So, a lot of times we say that why are you not like my wife says, why are you not reacting to certain things. So, this is thing, right. So, I am not, my latency is slow, for example, right. So, so a lot of emotional quotient related to what she is saying maybe, but that is the whole point, that when we create this kind of emotional reactivity, so we can get interesting measures. So, this latency to the emotional stimuli can come from also this response time, which is in these behavioral measures like jerks. So, now this is the red line here, this is the behavior plot that is actually averaged out from all subjects. Now, even though this looks very messy and all, now once we average them, now meaning what, how would I average them? So, this is something that your expected sort of the curve where the emotion is going to change based on Nandini's study. So, you have all these different event boundaries where the raga change, and you are expected to go from very happy to sad and then very happy and sad. I think this was the one that is the highest, like happiness, it started with the Tilak Kamod and going to Basant Mukhari. So, this was one of the main big ones. So, where you go from very high, very happy to sad. So, but what you also see, these are the subjects response to this valence rating, these are the, and this is the smooth response. We didn't do a lot of smoothing, but a little bit of smoothing, but what really you can see that at every event boundary this thing changed. So, there is almost a stability here of emotion, and then it changed around this point when there is the emotion jumped off from here to here, and then again the remarkable one is kind of coming from when it goes from abrupt sad to happy, you see just jump, which is with a latency, and then again it comes from this happy to sad, there is again a jump. So, essentially the subject is kind of following what we were expecting, like across the board, across, once we average out the stimuli, taking out the behavioral data, we kind of developed some kind of a first person centric sort of a behavioral paradigm where we can record their emotion, and this is something remarkable, it is not done previously, this is something not been achieved previously. So, the latency is something, yeah, we did not find, I am still not convinced, it is not very significant. We looked at the latencies to different ragas, and what you see when the raga changes, the latencies to these ragas, these even from these event boundaries are not changing, these looks the distributions of this latency acceleration, what happened following a reaction, the acceleration change that happened following an event boundary was not changing across different kind of ragas. Yes, you first and then yeah. It is not too long, right. So, it is the overall, no, it is not like 10 to 12 minutes, and this most all the people that we took, and I will show, so with some behavioral data like cognitive data that we took, that they do not have a lot of like high score on their musicality training. So, all of them were non-musicians, and they are not very, I mean they might have heard ragas, you cannot avoid ragas in general from life here in India, but they are not really like very familiar with it, or like connoisseurs of it, or even had training in it. I mean there was no musical training attached to the subject. So, we will likely they will not be like, they would not associate these ragas typically with music, they are not trained to do that, but musicians are. So, the musicians who play this kind of music, they are like they are trained to feel. So, this is the first kind of training they get, that that they to feel the music. So, this but that like a regular typical person don't have that. So, yeah, so this for we are hoping this is new for them, and hence it can be used as an assessment tool, at least for non musicians.
No, so if you have the same raga extended over a long time, that's not here. What would you expect? Would you expect it to sort of?
Yes, so it will depend on it depends on the same rag itself. It's like the rendering and all these thing changes. So it also goes from typically, and this is something that Nandini showed. There are another component of raga is this tempo. So for example, speed. The same raga can be played in a alap phase, there is a gat phase, and there is this teen tal phase. The teen tal phase with all these accompaniments like tabla and all, which makes the tempo faster. So that is typically associated a raga which gives you a melancholy feeling in a alap phase, is going to give you a very happy feeling in that teen tal phase. When you increase the beat, so it essentially changes your arousal, and it again going back to James Lang, that that it creates this happy feeling about it, right. So this is the idea. Yes.
One thing is where the music makes me feel. The other aspect is what I think the music is trying to convey.
Huh.
By operating the joystick, how do you ensure that they're not conscious as to
Yes, I mean there is absolutely no clear cut way. So, but of course, I mean since they are like they are like instructed not to overthink about the music. I mean they just supposed to go with the flow. This is exactly the instruction that is given. That you just respond how you are feeling. That's it. The way that whether you are feeling very positive about the music, or you are very feeling sad about the music, or excited about it. That's what they are told. They are specifically told you don't have to, there is no correct or wrong answer here. You are not supposed to do in a definitive way, or you don't have to match some kind of prediction. So previous or experimenter's prediction, there is no test going on here. Everybody goes through different sort of kind of levels of emotional like response, so you just go with the flow kind of thing. Yeah. So the questionnaire, so we also looked at the trait. Yeah. Timing in what sense?
Like if it is too long, they might be drifting into a bored state sometime.
So this is an interesting question. So we have not explored it in a very rigorous way. So if you see, each raga sort of is of different sort of length. The rationale was that at no way they should be able to predict, like if they are non-musicians, they should predict about the emotion that they feel, but they should not be reporting about the change, expecting some sort of a change in the raga at a finite interval. So this is how we made sure that that they cannot anticipate switching of the ragas or things like that, even if they figure out one change in the stimuli, but that timing your brain always associate, there is a change around roughly at that time. So we can expect another change happening at another time. So exactly for that reason all these lengths are different. So we have actually data to address whether that actually creates, when you do this kind of psychological experiments, and this is like based on my training with behavioral psychologists for a long time from my PhD. So I can tell you, yes, there is an effect of that. So when you play for a longer time, things gets to more stabilized, but then you don't go beyond too long a duration. Here we are not crossing 3 seconds, because the reason again for that is that we want to have the lowest TR, because we want the MRI TR to be aligned to this. So the lowest TR that is possible in an MR machine is that 1.2 second. We don't want to go lower than that, because that will be too dynamic for MRI to handle. So that's why we don't go too low, but we also don't go like 5 minutes long raga, that is too long. Yeah. Okay. So latency is there, I talked about it. So these are the 3 kind of measures one can use. The musical sophistication index, this is for your musicality training. These are like, as you will see that lot of all people in this used, their ability like musicality is very low. There is also Beck's depression inventory and this generalized anxiety disorder severity score. These are things that we employ, take questionnaire. So, we ask them to fill the questionnaire and they fill, we rate them, we figure out the numbers associated with it. And believe it or not, very interestingly, even in a subclinical population, people who have no history, there is this huge fluctuation of this score, which is quite amazing. So, so this is what the musical abilities of the participant pool. As you see, they are highly, like, or not highly, I would say moderately emotional. Their perceptual ability was quite high, but their musical training, as you see, they are very low. So, these are the sort of features of the data that you expect in the subject. On the other hand, if you see that they are in the moderate range. So, you are I think clinically depressed around from here. So, as you see, there are some people who are actually clinically depressed in our population, they just do not know that. It is still part of the database, and also same for anxiety. So, we looked at this. So, then we kind of looked at this
data is mainly from NBRC, which is
suggesting
that the students in NBRC are clinically depressed.
Not all of them, not all of them. No, but there are some students from Delhi University also. So,
in Delhi.
In Delhi, North India, yeah. Now, do not make that a example, but road rage, clinically depressed, all sorts of things. Anyway, so what we kind of start looking at this, that when we look at this latency of responses, and there you see a very nice correlation, which is very strong, at least in a biological sense, that that with the depression scores, the latency of these responses. So, emotional reactivity, we could actually guess even in a subclinical population on a subject by subject basis using this kind of measure. So, it gives you a lot of presence and value to this kind of stimuli. Yes, you had a question.
Sir, in those violent plots, the medians were very close. So, like, what is statistically significant previous slides, like 2-3 slides back?
No, I did not say that they were I did not compare across that. So, this one, right. So, yeah, they were not statistically significant, that is exactly. Yes, so this is why this is what I am saying. This in a way it is a good thing, in a way it is a bad thing. So, in a way the good thing is that so there is some kind of a physiological response are not different across different kind of ragas. So, in a sense that subject is following the instructions. So, they are just reacting to whatever with whatever quick as they are possible. Okay.
But can you trust this pattern? It might change, because
well, the reason again the trust factor comes from this. So, the trust factor comes from this was the expected curve. I think that one slide back where I showed you that group result, yeah, this one. So, see, this matches your expected curve. So, the subjects have no way to know that this is the expected curve, this is very complicated. So, this is an underlying expected curve. As an experimenter, you generated completely naturalistic music. What I am claiming that if you see the correlation between this is 0.61, it is huge. So, essentially the subjects are actually doing what you are expecting them to do. So, that is what I am trying to say, that this kind of stimuli is very good in terms of assessing a dynamic state of emotion. So, yes, so you can trust this, that they are doing what they are supposed to do. Now, this one I am not, the goal is not to compare between them, just to look at their trading, the levels where they are for each one of these values. Yeah. Again, this one is meant for comparison, but yeah. So, this is the main thing that we found, that these are scores are correlated, and again we go to the depression scores and we see there is a this also when we individually go from this, here it is written from the 7th to 8th raga is again this happy to sad and sad to happy. I will come back to this with the brain data a little bit. So, these are something that sort of that we get. Now, if we have their these trait measures and this QES score, which is again a psychological paradigm to assess their emotion, there is no correlation. So, what essentially the emotional tool that we have created with the music, it is kind of correlated with the subclinical levels of depression and anxiety markers, which is not recoverable from the standard measures that the physicians use. So, that is the whole point. Yeah. So, these kind of tools that we develop with these kinematic tools give you a better way to access the tools. We also looked at the brain networks, and this is very interesting. So, now as you saw those raster, so you can take each subject's data and go through the phases where you can have the subjects changing emotion versus the stable emotion. So, if you look in this acceleration versus non acceleration states, right, if I take into account and I take the difference, these are the limbic regions that are popping out in this MRI analysis, fMRI analysis. So, meaning this activity in these limbic regions are more in the accelerated states compared to the non accelerated states, meaning when they are accelerating and getting into this emotional steady state, their limbic regions are actually active. Now, what happens in the non accelerated and accelerated state? And this is something very interesting, that if you do it this other way around, you see this entire frontoparietal networks and all these networks which are associated with cognitive flexibility that Dipanjan was talking about earlier. So, all those areas are getting activated. So, when you are changing through the emotion, it is your frontoparietal networks are getting active, your attentional system is more active, but when you are in the middle of some kind of emotion, it is your limbic system is getting active. So, these are the things that we can do with this kind of stimuli. We have done it in a different way, we have done it a inter-subject correlation. Basically, this is not like a GLM based statistical mapping, but we can take at individual subject behavior and then correlate their behavior, phases of their happiness to other people's happiness, and look at the data that way. And again we found out the similar kind of stuff that we looked at this, we recovered this frontoparietal and these other networks together. So, naturalistic stimuli. So, cut the long story short, is gives you a very good platform to get to the depression scores, get to the anxiety scores at a subject by subject level, as well as gives you a very good sort of marker to look at subclinical levels of depression. So, and we can also look at the capture the dynamics of the emotion state switching regulation, detailed measurements of behavior. This is the first phase of analysis. We also want to look at the statistics of how emotion change. For example, in fact, one can even think about designing certain transitions which will mimic something like a first passage time problem in physics with the way of switching, and this kind of behaviors can be predicted from a thermodynamic sense. So, those are some things that we are coming up and thinking about. So, now, how do you measure, like I talked about earlier when we talked about emotion in the historical perspective, you have to look at emotion from the view of looking into this all these other physiological systems such as the other organs of the body, the heart and the particularly the heart at the first phase, but also as I said gut is another important sort of place to look at. So, so these are the typically the heart rates to different kind of stimuli. So, this is unpleasant stimuli does not ignite your heart rate. For example, pleasant stimuli increases the rate of heart rate variability, and this is something like a well known sort of a phenomena. So, now the question that we wanted to ask with this, that one of the way to the reason for measuring this heart rate is the low sort of the in the case of the heart rate, when you look at the very low frequencies, and low means like 0.04 to 0.15 hertz, this like much lower than the normal EEG kind of rhythms. This reflect the sympathetic sort of response to a sort of or the response of the sympathetic nervous system, which is this flight or fight, and versus the parasympathetic, which is the rest and the digest mode, which happens more. This parasympathetic system happens when we sleep, for example. That is why they say that your metabolism for functioning, it is important, like you are like de-stressed out during your sleep. So, this is the parasympathetic system. So, the 0.5 to 0.4 hertz activity reflects the activity from your heart rate. So, essentially if you look at the high frequency, if you divide the heart rate, so this is typically a cardiac rhythm. So, this is what we call is PQRS. So, this is the most salient one, as this R peak, and here you have this high frequency versus the low frequency zone. So, this part comes from the sort of the parasympathetic system, the high frequency one, and this one comes from the sympathetic system. So, this is the understanding. So, we kind of looked at this with this understanding, we kind of designed a stimuli. So, this is something like this, sounds like this. So, this where we reduce we obliterated the valence, we just ask people to rate their arousal, okay, 1D axis. So this is something like this. So as you can see, the stimuli doesn't have much of like happiness, positivity or negativity, but it has a lot of, as it changes in tempo, it has something to do with arousal, something to get very excited about. So as you see, it goes on increasing arousal. So this is, by the way, the title song of Dunkirk, the movie Dunkirk. So have you? It's a very nice movie. Yeah. So anyway, so this is how the mean arousal ratings of the subjects are. So this is how it goes. I think. Yeah. For some reason, this video is not playing. But anyway, you get the idea. It's the same thing like I showed you before with the Hindustani classical ragas. And again, what we see that there is a correlation with this emotionality of these scores, but we didn't get much of correlation with the depression and anxiety in this particular case, because I think we are not going through all those valence and these others. So valence is important for to look at depression, but we could actually look at the emotionality is quite correlated with this kind of this thing. So since this was scores, so what we sort of wanted to look at is this was going back to that idea of the dimensions. So as you can see that we have these different trait measures, the state anxiety, perceived trait, negative affect, depression. So we took the PCA, the principal component of this, and we kind of looked at, and it kind of the subjects kind of failed in two groups, sort of one is this group and the one is the positive affect group. So and these two factors were essentially, we can look at this mean arousal that we have for subjects, we can correlate with these two factors, and again we are seeing a very good nice correlation which is coming out. So we couldn't individually get the correlation between the depression and anxiety, but once we started looking at this PCA based approach, a dimensional approach where we can look at all these depression and anxiety as coming out from different kind of a one multidimensional system, we can start looking at these arousal ratings. Again this is helpful. So these arousal ratings indeed can get to the relative to the trait measures better than a lot of the psychological measures do. So now to look at this, interestingly what we found out also, unfortunately in this data we did not find a distinction, we could not see a distinction between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system. So we could not ignite the sympathetic system which we should have, but for some strange reason we could not find that in EEG. But what we kind of looked at is this EEG from the heart rate variability data in the cardiac data, not the EEG, sorry, the ECG. And now what we could then look at is that since we could not find that frequency difference between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system, what we wanted to ask was whether the cardiac representation on the brain is changing, and how do we check that? We can actually time log the brain activity to the R peak and compute something called this heart evoked potential, and this is something with Dipanjan we have another work in bioarchive which we show that this is across ages from young to old, you have a change in the representation of how cardiac rhythms are represented in the heart. So it is a good marker for healthy aging, for example. So we could see this. So we use this heart evoked potential, and as you see this is what I told you that it is not affecting. So this is the aroused state versus the rest state, and again we are seeing there is a change in the heart evoked potential of how this cardiac rhythm is represented in the brain is changing based on whether you are aroused versus you are at rest. So we have data for the resting state of how at the when you are not listening to any kind of music, how your heart evoked potential is changing. For example, how your heartbeats are mapped to your brain, because heartbeat does not stop, right, it goes perpetually. So, you can always look at heart evoked potential whether you are at rest or you are at aroused state, and what we found out that this pattern changes. There is a difference, as you can see, between the R peak, when the R peak starts in the heart rhythm, the cardiac rhythms, and there is a change in the sort of activity which we find in this EEG rhythm. So, that actually is quite interesting, and this is where we are at now, in the sense that we can actually differentiate between this using the heart evoked potential. So, heart as a marker to set your emotion, we can look at arousal in a different way. So, in some sense you can think about how James Lang was talking about, that how arousal systems are generating your brain rhythms. What we think that this is actually coming through your physiological system to the heart, and then it is being represented in the brain, this kind of computations. Now, I do not know exactly to make sense of this, the entire story is not clear to us, the mechanistic story, that there are lots of nuts and bolts that we need to figure out, but at least emotion arousal to music does not leave traces in inter heartbeat variability at ultra low frequency range. So, this is the question that that we are interested in. Now, there is something that we sort of did, and I am not presenting that because it involves a computational model. So, I think that is using a neural field theory kind of models, where we look at cortex and the thalamus as two different kind of layers or different systems, populations, and look at their field activity. So, it is based on these partial differential equation models. One can apply those kind of theories, but this is something that what we think is going on. So, this is Joseph Ledoux, who is one of the pioneers of a lot of these ideas. So, going back to that model of cannon bird, so the thalamus is something like what he calls is the grand central station, like it is like something this or you can relate it to Mumbai Central or Chennai Central Station. There is some kind of expressway which goes to, from here once the stimulus goes based on some kind of appraisal, it goes to this frontal cortex immediately to, for example, making certain kind of decisions, versus it can go to some sort of fear stimuli, can go to amygdala, for example, if there is something alarming, which is this, that is what he calls the amygdala as a smoke detector. So, this is the low road to some kind of emotion, and this also kind of gets fed back in the frontal cortex after it goes past the amygdala. So, these are the some things that we kind of sort of have, and this was I think we looked at the measures of the different kind of perceived internal states of the participant before the start of the experiment, and also these were actually quite variable across different, as you can see that Beck's depression, stress anxiety, state anxiety, PNS positive and negativity scores, and we have all these other variables. So, we kind of looked at all these different kind of correlations, and then which I kind of talked about in these other mental health measures. I would like to thank the funders like DBT, which has given us over the years a lot of money to do this research, and current grants are from Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports, where we are looking at people who are doing boxing on a regular basis, athletes, how their brain connectivity and is changing over chronic, like head injuries like they have, and also with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for developing AI tools for low res imaging. We are also running the dementia program, which in the North India, and also recently we received this MIT Kanpur fund. And thank you all for listening, and also a lot of our collaborators, Dipanjan, who is sitting here, Abhijit, who did some modeling, Bina Koshi from CMC Vellore, with whom we are collaborating on a malnutrition cohort they have developed, where we looked at brain volumemetry over the course of early stage of development for children in affected by early sort of stress, malnutrition and things like that. And with Mohammed, we are working on developing this kind of paradigms. Actually, as we speak, we found very similar results in people in US, where they are like in the medical sort of, they are under surgery, and they have been implanted electrodes in their hippocampus and amygdala, and we have some beautiful recordings of their subjective behavior to Hindustani classical raga. So, which actually the behavioral patterns look very similar to the subjects at NBRC. So this is very interesting, and to all our volunteers who take parts in the experiments. Thank you very much. If you have any questions.